Hello there and welcome to the Twilight archive, where quiet curiosity meets the deep end of science and wonder is allowed to take its time. I'm your host, and tonight we're going to venture into something that sits right at the edge of human memory itself. We're not talking about your childhood or even recorded history. We're going back much, much further, to a time when the very definition of human was more complicated than we might imagine. You see, there's something profoundly unsettling about extinction when it hits close to home. When we think about the dinosaurs vanishing 66 million years ago, it feels safely distant, almost like reading about aliens from another world. But what happens when extinction touches something that looks back at us with eyes we might recognize? What happens when the lost species carried tools, made art, and buried their dead with flowers? Tonight, we're following the final whispers of our closest relatives, the Neanderthals. And I want to be very specific about what we're exploring here, because this isn't the full story of Neanderthal civilization. That would take us back hundreds of thousands of years, across vast stretches of Europe and Asia, through ice ages and warm periods, through the development of sophisticated stone tools and the first evidence of symbolic thought. No, we're focusing on something much more intimate and haunting. We're going to spend the next few hours walking through their final 5,000 years on Earth. 5,000 years. Let that settle for a moment. If you think about it, that's roughly the same span that separates us from the earliest Egyptian dynasties. It's the entire recorded history of human civilization compressed into what was, for the Neanderthals, their final chapter. During those 5 millennia, they went from being a successful species spread across multiple continents to scattered remnant populations clinging to isolated refuges, and then, around 40,000 years ago, to nothing at all. But here's what makes this story so compelling, and why we're dedicating tonight to it. The Neanderthals didn't vanish in some catastrophic event like an asteroid impact or volcanic supereruption. They faded away slowly, group by group, cave by cave, over dozens of human generations. And for much of that time, they weren't alone. Modern humans, people essentially identical to us, were moving into the same territories, sometimes living just valleys apart from the last Neanderthal families. You might be wondering how we can possibly know anything concrete about events from 40,000 years ago. It's a fair question. Written history only goes back about 5,000 years, and even our oldest cave paintings are maybe 30,000 years old. So how do we reconstruct the final chapters of an entire species that went extinct before agriculture, before pottery, before the first permanent settlements? The answer lies in what I like to think of as the archaeology of endings. Every Neanderthal settlement that was abandoned, every tool that was dropped and never picked up again, every hearth that went cold for the final time, these leave traces. Microscopic ones, sometimes. Chemical signatures in soil layers. Patterns of wear on stone tools that tell us how they were used and by whom. Fragments of bone and tooth that carry genetic information we're only now learning to read. Modern science has given us extraordinary tools for reading these ancient whispers. Radiocarbon dating can tell us not just how old something is, but place it within windows of time narrow enough that we can sometimes track cultural changes across just a few generations. Ancient DNA analysis lets us peer into genetic relationships between populations separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years. Climate reconstructions from ice cores and lake sediments show us exactly what kind of world these final Neanderthal groups were trying to survive in. And what emerges from all this evidence is a story that's simultaneously vast and intimate. Vast because it spans continents and millennia, because it touches on climate change, human migration, technological innovation, and evolutionary biology. But intimate because at its heart, it's about families. About small groups of people who hunted together, shared fires together, buried their dead together, and passed down knowledge from one generation to the next, even as their world was shrinking around them. We're going to follow this story geographically, moving from the great river valleys where Neanderthals first encountered modern humans, down into the isolated peninsulas and mountain refuges where the last populations held on, and finally to places like Gibraltar, the Rock, where some of the very last Neanderthal remains have been found, dating to perhaps 28,000 years ago. These weren't abstract evolutionary processes. These were real people making real decisions about where to hunt, where to shelter, how to respond to changing seasons and changing neighbors. We'll examine their tools and ask what they tell us about innovation under pressure. We'll look at their genetics and discover how small their populations had become, small enough that every birth mattered, every loss was felt across entire communities. We'll track the climate data and see how the advancing ice sheets created both opportunities and impossible challenges. But perhaps most importantly, we'll grapple with what their story means for us. Because the Neanderthals weren't some primitive predecessor to modern humans. They were our contemporaries, our competitors, and ultimately, our relatives. Before they disappeared, they left traces of themselves in our own genomes through interbreeding. We carry their DNA today. In a very real sense, they never completely vanished. Their extinction represents something unique in the archaeological record, the only time in human history when two different human species shared the same landscapes, competed for the same resources, and possibly even communicated with each other. The outcome of that encounter shaped everything that came after. Every human culture, every technological innovation, every work of art and music and literature since then has emerged from the world the surviving species, us, built after the Neanderthals were gone. So tonight, as we settle in for this journey, we're not just exploring ancient history. We're exploring the deepest roots of our own story, and asking questions that remain surprisingly urgent. How do populations survive under pressure? What determines which cultures persist and which disappear? How do we recognize the early signs when a way of life is ending? The Neanderthals lived through changes that would have seemed unimaginable to their ancestors. And as we'll see, their responses to those changes, the choices they made, the innovations they attempted, the refuges they sought, illuminate something profound about resilience, adaptation, and what it means to be human in a world that never stops changing. Shall we begin? Picture Europe 45,000 years ago, and you're looking at a landscape that would be almost unrecognizable today. We're in the middle of what scientists call marine isotope stage 3, a relatively mild period between the crushing ice advances of the last glacial maximum. The continent is a patchwork of grasslands, scattered forests, and river valleys that serve as highways for both game and the hunters who follow them. And for the first time in human history, two distinct species of people are about to share the same territory. The Neanderthals have been here for hundreds of thousands of years. They know every seasonal migration route, every shelter, every flint outcrop worth the journey. Their ancestors weathered ice ages that would have broken other species, developed technologies perfectly suited to European conditions, and built a way of life so successful it seemed eternal. But success, as we'll discover, can become its own trap when the world suddenly changes. Now, moving up from the southeast, come the modern humans, our direct ancestors. They've spent tens of thousands of years crossing continents, island hopping through Indonesia, learning to live in deserts and tropical forests and everything in between. And they bring something new to Europe, not just different tools or different hunting strategies, but different ways of thinking about the world itself. How do we know about this convergence? The evidence is written in stone, quite literally. At sites across Europe, archaeologists have mapped what they call the transition horizon, that moment in the archaeological record where Neanderthal remains and artifacts begin appearing alongside the tools and bones of modern humans. It's not a clean line. In some places, the transition happens quickly. In others, it stretches across thousands of years. Let's visit one of these sites together. Imagine you're standing in the Périgord region of southwestern France, in what will someday become one of the world's most famous archaeological landscapes. Here, in caves like Le Moustier and Combe-Capelle, layers of sediment preserve a timeline that reads like chapters in a book. The lower levels contain classic Neanderthal tools, those carefully crafted Mousterian points and scrapers we discussed earlier. But as you move up through the layers, representing movement forward through time, something remarkable happens. The tools begin to change. We start seeing blade technology, longer, thinner stone tools that require a different kind of knapping technique. We find bone tools, ornaments, evidence of symbolic behavior. And eventually, we discover something that makes archaeologists' hearts race: the two traditions existing side by side, sometimes in the same cave systems, sometimes separated by just a few kilometers and perhaps only a few generations. But here's where the story gets complicated, because the archaeological record doesn't tell us exactly what this convergence looked like day to day. Were these two populations in direct contact? Were they avoiding each other? Were they competing for the same resources, or had they found ways to partition the landscape? Some clues come from the distribution of sites. In many regions, we see what appears to be geographic segregation. Neanderthals tend to occupy certain types of locations, often caves and rock shelters in hilly or mountainous terrain, places they'd used successfully for millennia. Modern humans, meanwhile, seem to prefer river valleys and open-air sites, locations that offer access to broader landscapes and seasonal migration routes. This pattern suggests something fascinating, that the two populations might have been practicing what ecologists call niche partitioning. Think of it like two closely related animal species that manage to coexist by exploiting slightly different resources or using the same resources at different times. The classic example is Darwin's finches on the Galapagos, different species with different beak shapes, each perfectly adapted to different seeds. But there's evidence of direct interaction too. At some sites in France and Spain, archaeologists have found what appear to be hybrid tool traditions. The Châtelperronian culture, for instance, combines traditional Neanderthal techniques with innovations that seem borrowed from modern human toolkits. We'll explore this more closely later, but for now, consider what it implies: knowledge was being shared somehow, somewhere, between these two peoples. The question that keeps archaeologists awake at night is whether this sharing was peaceful or violent, accidental or intentional. Did Neanderthal and modern human children play together in some ancient valley? Did hunters from both species share information around fires? Or was the knowledge transfer more indirect, perhaps one group observing another from a distance, copying techniques without direct contact? Genetic evidence offers some tantalizing clues. We now know that interbreeding occurred between Neanderthals and modern humans, probably multiple times and in multiple locations. The DNA signatures suggest these encounters happened both early in the overlap period and continued right up until the end of Neanderthal existence. So at least some of the meetings between these two species were intimate enough to produce offspring. But here's the sobering reality: regardless of how these encounters played out on an individual level, the statistical outcome was already being written. Modern humans were arriving in Europe with several crucial advantages that would prove decisive over the long term. First, they came with more diverse and sophisticated tool technologies. Not necessarily better in every circumstance, but more adaptable, more suitable for exploiting a wider range of environments and resources. Second, they appear to have had more complex social networks, trade relationships and information exchanges that span vast distances. Third, and perhaps most importantly, they had larger and more genetically diverse populations. You see, when two closely related species compete for similar resources, it often comes down to numbers and networking. The species with larger, more connected populations has more genetic diversity to draw upon when conditions change, more individuals to try different survival strategies, and more resilient when local disasters strike. It's not that they're necessarily smarter or stronger, they're just more numerous and more connected. The Neanderthals, magnificent as they were, had spent hundreds of thousands of years perfectly adapted to European conditions. But that perfection came with a cost: specialization. When the rules of survival suddenly changed, when new competitors arrived with different strategies and larger numbers, that deep specialization became a vulnerability. And so we move into the heart of our story, where we'll see how this great convergence played out across the next 15,000 years. Because what happened next wasn't a simple replacement of one species by another. It was something far more complex, more gradual, and ultimately more haunting than anyone could have predicted. So how do we actually know what happened 30,000 years ago? How can we be so confident about dates and timelines when we're dealing with fragments of bone and scattered stone tools? The answer lies in what might be the most elegant detective work in all of science: the careful reconstruction of deep time from the smallest possible clues. Imagine you're an archaeologist in 1950, standing in a cave somewhere in France, holding a piece of fossilized bone. You know it's old, certainly older than recorded history, but beyond that, you're essentially guessing. The best you could do was relative dating: this layer is older than that one, this artifact style came before this other one. It was like trying to read a book where someone had torn out all the page numbers. Then came radiocarbon dating, and suddenly we had a clock. Not just any clock, a clock that had been ticking steadily inside every piece of organic material for tens of thousands of years. The principle is beautifully simple. All living things absorb carbon-14 from the atmosphere while they're alive. The moment they die, that absorption stops, and the carbon-14 begins to decay at a completely predictable rate. Half of it disappears every 5,730 years, like the most reliable metronome in the universe. But here's where it gets interesting for our Neanderthal story. Radiocarbon dating only works back to about 50,000 years, and even then, contamination can throw off results dramatically. A tiny bit of modern organic material, a root hair that grew into ancient bone, a drop of groundwater carrying dissolved carbon, can make a 30,000-year-old sample appear to be only 15,000 years old. We've learned this the hard way. In the 1990s, scientists began to realize that many of the dates they'd been relying on for the latest Neanderthal sites were probably wrong. Too young. The contamination problem meant that what looked like evidence for Neanderthals surviving until 25,000 years ago might actually be evidence of contaminated samples from much earlier periods. It was a sobering revelation that sent researchers back to their collections, demanding more rigorous protocols and better techniques. The breakthrough came with something called ultrafiltration. Instead of just cleaning bone samples, scientists learned to dissolve them almost completely, then extract only the purest collagen, the protein that forms the scaffold of bone. They developed ways to remove even microscopic contamination, amino acid by amino acid. Suddenly, dates that had seemed reliable shifted backward in time by 5,000, sometimes 10,000 years. Take the site of Saint-Césaire in France. For decades, it was famous for yielding one of the youngest Neanderthal fossils ever found, apparently dating to just 36,000 years ago. But when researchers applied these new purification techniques, that date shifted to closer to 41,000 years ago. 5,000 years might not sound like much in the grand sweep of prehistory, but for understanding the last Neanderthals, it's everything. Those 5 millennia could represent the difference between coexistence and replacement. And then ancient DNA arrived on the scene, and the game changed completely. The first ancient DNA extracted from Neanderthal bones came from the original Neanderthal Valley specimen in 1997. It was just a tiny fragment of mitochondrial DNA, but it was revolutionary. For the first time, we could read genetic information that had been locked in bone for 40,000 years. Think about that for a moment. we were literally reading the genetic instructions that had shaped a Neanderthal's cellular metabolism before our species had even figured out agriculture. But extracting ancient DNA is like trying to reassemble a book that's been run through a paper shredder, then left outside during a few thousand storms. DNA degrades quickly after death, breaking down into shorter and shorter fragments. By the time we find ancient bones, we're dealing with genetic sequences that might be only 50 to 100 base pairs long, mixed in with DNA from bacteria, fungi, and every other organism that's lived in that soil since the bone was buried. The contamination problem here is even worse than with radiocarbon dating. Human DNA gets everywhere. Every archaeologist who's handled a bone, every researcher who's studied it, every tourist who's breathed on it in a museum display case, they've all potentially left traces of their genetic material behind. For years, this made ancient DNA results deeply suspect. Were we actually sequencing Neanderthal genes, or were we sequencing the genes of the graduate student who'd cleaned the specimen? Then came the technical revolution of the 2000s. Clean rooms with filtered air. Protective suits. Protocols that traced every sample from excavation to analysis. And most importantly, ways to distinguish ancient DNA from modern contamination by looking at damage patterns. Ancient DNA has a characteristic signature, specific types of chemical damage that accumulate over thousands of years. Modern contamination doesn't show these patterns. By 2010, we had the first complete Neanderthal genome. Not from one individual, but reconstructed from fragments found in bones from 3 different Neanderthal women who lived in Croatia's Vindiger cave around 38,000 years ago. Suddenly, we weren't just dating when Neanderthals lived, we could read their genetic relationships to each other and to us. The genome revealed something startling. These late Neanderthals showed signs of extremely low genetic diversity, much lower than any modern human population. Their genomes looked like those of species that had been through severe population bottlenecks, periods when their numbers dropped so low that genetic variation was permanently lost. Some regions of their DNA were so similar between individuals that they appeared almost inbred. But perhaps the most powerful tool for understanding the last Neanderthals came from combining these techniques. When you can extract ancient DNA from a bone and also get a reliable radiocarbon date from the same sample, you can start to build family trees through time. You can track how populations moved, when they became isolated, how their genetic diversity changed as their world grew smaller. This is how we know that the story of Neanderthal extinction isn't simple. The dates and DNA together paint a picture of populations that were already struggling long before modern humans arrived in Europe. They show us groups that had been isolated for thousands of years, genetic lineages that had diverged and then converged again as populations crashed and merged. Every technique has its limitations, its blind spots, its margins of error. But when multiple independent methods start telling the same story, when radiocarbon dates align with genetic evidence and both match what we see in the archaeological record, we can begin to trust what the bones are telling us. And what they're telling us is that the final chapter of the Neanderthal story was more complex, more gradual, and more poignant than anyone had imagined. And so we find ourselves looking at a map of Europe as it existed 40,000 years ago, trying to understand what it meant to be a Neanderthal as the world literally closed in around you. Picture this continent not as the patchwork of nations we know today, but as a vast canvas where ice and forest and steppe painted themselves in broad strokes across thousands of years. The ice sheets were never static. They breathed like living things, advancing and retreating in cycles that played out over millennia. During the coldest periods, glacier stretched down from Scandinavia like frozen fingers, reaching almost to the modern borders of Germany. From the Alps, other ice masses crept outward, turning much of what we now call France into an Arctic wasteland. And here's what we need to understand: Neanderthals weren't just passive observers of this transformation. They had been living through these cycles for hundreds of thousands of years, adapting, moving, surviving. But something was different about this final glacial period. The ice was more severe, more persistent. And now, for the first time, there was competition. We can trace the shrinking of Neanderthal territory through the archaeological record with surprising precision. Around 40,000 years ago, their range extended from the Atlantic coast of Portugal all the way to the Altai Mountains of Siberia. It was a vast territory, encompassing forests and plains and river valleys where small bands could live relatively isolated lives, following herds of mammoth and reindeer, knowing every cave and water source across hundreds of square kilometers. By 35,000 years ago, that range had contracted dramatically. The northern populations had vanished entirely. The eastern groups were gone. What remained were scattered refugia, small pockets of suitable habitat where the last Neanderthal populations clung to familiar ways of life even as the world transformed around them. Now, when we use the word refugia, we're borrowing a term from biology. It describes those special places where species survive during periods of environmental stress. Think of them as islands of stability in a sea of change. For the late Neanderthals, these refugia were primarily in three regions: the Iberian Peninsula, the Italian Peninsula, and parts of the Balkans. Each of these areas had unique advantages that made survival possible even as conditions deteriorated elsewhere. The Iberian Peninsula, particularly its southern regions, remained relatively warm and ice-free. Archaeological sites like Zafaria Cave in Spain and Figueira Brava in Portugal show continuous Neanderthal occupation well into the final millennia. These coastal and near-coastal locations provided access to both terrestrial game and marine resources. Imagine small groups of perhaps 20 or 30 individuals living in caves that faced the Mediterranean, watching the sun set over waters that held dolphins and seals and shellfish. In the Italian peninsula, sites like Grotta di Fiumane and Riparo Mezzana tell similar stories of persistence. Here, Neanderthals found themselves pressed between advancing alpine glacier to the north and changing sea levels to the south, but the peninsula's elongated geography created microclimates and ecological niches that could support small populations. The Balkans present perhaps the most complex picture. This region, with its mountainous terrain and varied environments, seems to have harbored Neanderthal populations in scattered valleys and upland areas. Sites like Vindija Cave in Croatia show evidence of some of the latest Neanderthal occupations in Central Europe, dating to around 32,000 years ago. But here's where the story becomes more nuanced than simple climate change might suggest. These refugia weren't just isolated by ice and cold. They were also being surrounded by expanding populations of modern humans. Archaeological evidence shows that as Neanderthal range contracted, modern human sites began appearing with increasing frequency around the edges of these refuge areas. You might be wondering, what does this kind of geographic compression actually mean for a species? The answer involves some basic principles of population ecology that apply whether we're talking about Neanderthals or any other organism facing habitat loss. First, smaller territories support smaller populations. This isn't just a matter of arithmetic, it's about the carrying capacity of the land itself. Each environment can only sustain so many large mammals, whether they're cave bears or Neanderthals. As the available habitat shrinks, so does the total population that habitat can support. Second, smaller populations are inherently more vulnerable to random catastrophes. A harsh winter, a volcanic eruption, an epidemic disease, the local extinction of a key prey species, events that a large, distributed population might weather easily can devastate a small, isolated group. Third, and perhaps most importantly, isolated populations lose genetic diversity over time. This isn't speculation, we can see it happening in the ancient DNA extracted from late Neanderthal remains. The genetic bottlenecks become increasingly severe as we move forward in time, suggesting that these final populations were indeed becoming dangerously small and inbred. Let's pause for a moment and consider what this meant in human terms. These weren't abstract population statistics, these were people. Small groups who had lived in the same valleys, perhaps, for dozens of generations. They knew every seasonal migration route, every fruiting tree, every water source that didn't freeze in winter. Their stone tools carried the accumulated wisdom of millennia, passed down from parent to child in an unbroken chain stretching back to the very origins of human culture. And yet, with each passing generation, their world grew smaller. The familiar hunting grounds to the north became too cold, too dangerous, or simply empty of prey. The valleys where their grandparents had lived were now occupied by strange people who made different tools and spoke different languages. The very geography of survival was contracting around them like a tightening net. We can map this contraction through radiocarbon dates and archaeological assemblages, but the emotional reality of it, the gradual realization that the old ways might not be enough anymore, that remains largely hidden from us. What we can say with confidence is that by 28,000 years ago, the last Neanderthal populations had retreated to the very edges of Europe itself, to places like the Rock of Gibraltar, where the continent ends and the endless Atlantic begins. And it's to these final refuges, these last strongholds of an ancient way of life, that we turn our attention next. Picture yourself standing at the very southern tip of Europe, where the limestone cliffs of Gibraltar rise 2,000 feet above the narrow strait that separates two continents. Behind you stretches the familiar bulk of Europe, Spain, France, the vast territories where Neanderthals had lived for hundreds of thousands of years. Before you lies the unknown expanse of Africa, visible on clear days as a hazy line across 14 kilometers of choppy water. This is where the continent ends, where the Mediterranean meets the Atlantic, and where some of the very last Neanderthals made their final stand. We know this because of what archaeologists found when they began exploring the caves that honeycomb Gibraltar's eastern face. In 1848, long before anyone had even heard the name Neanderthal, quarry workers blasting limestone from Forbes Quarry uncovered a skull that would later prove to be one of the first Neanderthal specimens ever discovered. But it was another cave, high on the cliff face and facing east toward the rising sun, that would yield some of our most precious evidence of these final populations. Gorham's Cave sits about 100 feet above sea level, accessible today only by boat and a precarious scramble up the rock face. But 28,000 years ago, when sea levels were much lower and the Mediterranean coastline extended far beyond its current boundaries, this cave would have been set back from a broader coastal plain, offering both shelter and a commanding view of the hunting grounds below. The cave itself is surprisingly spacious, a high-ceilinged chamber that opens onto a natural terrace, with smaller alcoves and passages extending back into the rock. When Clive Finlayson and his team began systematic excavations here in the 1990s, they uncovered something remarkable, layer after layer of Neanderthal occupation stretching back over 100,000 years. But it was the uppermost layers that captured the world's attention. Here, just beneath deposits that clearly showed the arrival of modern humans, they found Neanderthal tools, Neanderthal hearths, and most importantly, charcoal that could be radiocarbon dated. The dates that came back were stunning. 28,000 years ago, give or take a few hundred years. This was at least 4,000 years more recent than any other confirmed Neanderthal site in Europe. If accurate, these dates pushed the extinction of Neanderthals thousands of years later than anyone had imagined, creating what some researchers call the Gibraltar problem, evidence that seemed almost too late to be true. But let's slow down and ask ourselves what life might have been like for these final Neanderthal populations clinging to existence on the rock. The climate data tells us that 28,000 years ago, Europe was deep in the grip of the last glacial maximum. Ice sheets stretched across northern Europe, and even Mediterranean regions like Gibraltar were significantly colder and drier than today. The coastal plains that we think extended beyond the current shoreline would have been covered in a sparse, steppe-like vegetation, not the rich woodlands that Neanderthals had traditionally preferred. Yet Gibraltar offered something that much of Europe could no longer provide: diversity. Even during the coldest periods of the Ice Age, this southern peninsula retained pockets of different environments within a relatively small area. The Neanderthals living in Gorham's Cave could hunt ibex and deer on the rocky slopes above, collect shellfish and marine resources from the coast below, and perhaps even venture into the slightly warmer valleys inland where remnant forests might still survive. The archaeological evidence from Gorham's Cave paints a picture of people adapting their lifestyle to increasingly challenging circumstances. We find evidence that these late Neanderthals were making more intensive use of marine resources than their predecessors, collecting limpets, mussels, and other shellfish from the shoreline. They were also hunting smaller game more frequently, suggesting that the large mammals they traditionally relied upon were becoming scarcer. Most intriguingly, we see evidence of what appears to be symbolic behavior. In 2014, researchers announced the discovery of a series of carved lines on the floor of Gorham's Cave, a crosshatch pattern deliberately scratched into the rock that shows no obvious functional purpose. If this truly represents Neanderthal art or symbolic expression, it would be among the latest examples of such behavior in the archaeological record. But Gorham's Cave wasn't the only site showing evidence of these final populations. Across the Gibraltar Peninsula, archaeologists have identified several other locations with late Neanderthal remains. Vanguard Cave, just a few hundred meters south of Gorham's, has yielded similar evidence of late occupation, as have sites like Devil's Tower rock shelter on the northern face of the rock. What emerges from these multiple sites is a picture of a small but persistent population that managed to maintain a presence on Gibraltar for perhaps thousands of years after Neanderthals had vanished from the rest of Europe. But we're talking about a tiny population. Genetic modeling suggests that the entire Gibraltar population might have numbered no more than a few dozen individuals at any given time. This raises a troubling question that we'll explore more deeply in our next section. How long can such a small population survive in isolation? The mathematics of population genetics are unforgiving. Small populations face a cascade of problems: inbreeding depression, genetic drift, and increased vulnerability to random catastrophes that might wipe out entire family groups. Even a single harsh winter, a disease outbreak, or a string of unsuccessful hunts could push such a population past the point of no recovery. And yet, for a time at least, these Gibraltar Neanderthals persevered. They continued to make their distinctive tools, to hunt and gather in the ways their ancestors had for millennia, and perhaps even to create art on the walls of their caves. They represent something both triumphant and tragic: the remarkable resilience of a people pushed to the very margins of existence, still maintaining their ancient way of life even as the world changed around them. But the climate was continuing to deteriorate, and somewhere to the north, modern human populations were expanding across Europe, bringing with them new technologies, new social organizations, and perhaps most importantly, larger population sizes that could better weather the challenges of the changing world. The final act of the Neanderthal story was about to begin, and it would be written in the harsh mathematics of survival in an increasingly unforgiving world. The Hunger Winters. That's what paleoclimatologists call the period between roughly 35,000 and 25,000 years ago, when Europe experienced some of the most severe and rapidly changing climate conditions of the entire Ice Age. And it's during these very years that the last Neanderthal populations were struggling to survive in their final refuges. To understand what our ancient relatives faced, we need to look at the ice core data from Greenland and the marine sediment records from the North Atlantic. These archives tell us that during the late Pleistocene, the climate wasn't just cold, it was violently unstable. We're talking about something called Dansgaard-Oeschger events, named after the scientists who first identified them. These were massive, rapid climate oscillations where temperatures could swing by 10 to 15 degrees Celsius within a matter of decades, sometimes even faster. Imagine you're a Neanderthal family living in what's now northern Spain around 30,000 years ago. Your grandparents might have told stories of abundant forests filled with red deer and wild boar. But now, within your own lifetime, you've watched those woodlands retreat southward, replaced by stark tundra where only reindeer and mammoths can thrive. The plant foods your people had relied on for hundreds of thousands of years, nuts, berries, roots, they're becoming increasingly scarce as the vegetation zones shift faster than ecosystems can adapt. The isotope evidence from European cave sediment shows us just how dramatic these changes were. We can read the story in the pollen grains preserved in lake beds, in the ratios of different carbon isotopes in ancient soil layers. What emerges is a picture of environmental chaos. Forests would expand during brief warming periods, only to be decimated again as temperatures plummeted. Rivers would freeze solid, then flood catastrophically during sudden thaws. But here's where it gets particularly challenging for small hunter-gatherer populations. When your survival depends on intimate knowledge of where to find food, what to eat during which seasons, how to track game animals, when that knowledge has been passed down through countless generations, what happens when the rules suddenly change? The archaeological record suggests that Neanderthals were remarkably conservative in their tool-making traditions and hunting strategies. This conservatism had served them well for hundreds of thousands of years, but now it was becoming a liability. We can see this playing out in the faunal remains from late Neanderthal sites. At Zafaria Cave in southern Spain, for instance, the bones tell a story of dietary stress. The Neanderthals there were hunting smaller game, processing bones more intensively to extract every bit of marrow, even turning to marine resources like shellfish, something that had never been a major part of their subsistence strategy before. And then there's the competition factor. Modern humans, with their more sophisticated tool technologies and apparently more flexible social organizations, were better equipped to handle these rapidly changing conditions. They could manufacture specialized hunting equipment, like spear throwers that increased projectile velocity, that gave them advantages in taking down large game. They had more complex trade networks that could buffer local resource shortages. When mammoths disappeared from one region, modern human groups could quickly shift their focus to reindeer or other prey species. The climatic data also reveals something particularly devastating: the collapse of what scientists call the mammoth steppe. This was a unique ecosystem that had supported enormous herds of large mammals, mammoths, woolly rhinoceros, giant deer, cave bears. These animals had been the backbone of Neanderthal subsistence for millennia. But as temperatures became more unstable and precipitation patterns shifted, this ecosystem began to fragment and ultimately disappear from much of Europe. You might be wondering how we know the climate was affecting Neanderthal populations so directly. Well, researchers have compared the timing of climatic events with the radiocarbon dates from the latest Neanderthal sites. What they found was a remarkable correlation. The most severe cold periods, the times when the isotope records show the harshest conditions, correspond almost exactly to gaps in the Neanderthal archaeological record. It's as if entire populations were simply disappearing during the worst climatic episodes. There's also evidence that suggests these weren't just temporary retreats. When we examine the genetic diversity preserved in late Neanderthal remains, we see signs of severe population bottlenecks. Small populations that have been reduced to just a few dozen or few hundred individuals show characteristic patterns in their DNA: reduced heterozygosity, increased homozygosity, the genetic signatures of inbreeding, and genetic drift. The hunger winters weren't just about cold temperatures and scarce resources, though those were certainly factors. They were about the speed of change. Modern human populations, with their larger group sizes and more extensive social networks, could adapt to shifting conditions more quickly. They could afford to lose some members to experimentation with new hunting techniques or exploration of new territories. Neanderthal populations, already reduced to small, isolated groups, couldn't take those risks. We see this pattern repeated across Europe during this period. In the Crimea, at sites like Koba, the latest Neanderthal layers show evidence of increasingly harsh living conditions. In the Balkans, at places like Vindiga Cave in Croatia, the final Neanderthal occupations are sparse and episodic, suggesting that these refuges could only support human populations intermittently. Perhaps most tellingly, we can trace the progressive abandonment of northern territories. The last Neanderthal sites in Germany date to around 40,000 years ago. In France, they disappear by about 35,000 years ago. The archaeological record shows a clear pattern of retreat toward the south and west, toward the climatic refuges of Iberia and the Mediterranean coastlines. But even in these final refuges, the climate wasn't stable. The marine sediment cores from the Mediterranean show that even these more temperate regions experience significant environmental fluctuations. Sea levels were dropping as more water became locked up in the expanding ice sheets, changing coastlines and altering marine ecosystems that some populations had begun to depend on. As we move forward in our story, we'll see how these climatic pressures played out in the final Neanderthal populations. But first, we need to understand something equally important: how these environmental challenges were reshaping Neanderthal technology and culture in their final millennia. Picture a Neanderthal craftsperson somewhere in southern France, perhaps 35,000 years ago. The world around them is transforming, not just the climate, but the very nature of who they share this landscape with. And yet, as they sit by firelight working a piece of flint, their hands move with the confidence of millennia. The techniques they're using? Some are as old as their ancestors, passed down through countless generations. Others are different, new. And that's where our story gets fascinating. We call these final Neanderthal technologies the transitional industries, and they represent one of the most intriguing puzzles in all of prehistoric archaeology. You might be wondering, if Neanderthals were struggling to survive, why would they be innovating? And if they were innovating, does that change everything we thought we knew about their extinction? Let's start with what we see in the archaeological record. The most famous of these late technologies is called the Châtelperronian, named after the cave of Châtelperron in central France where it was first identified. When archaeologists began finding these tool assemblages in the 1960s, they initially assumed they must be the work of early modern humans. The sophistication was simply too great, they thought, for Neanderthals. But then something remarkable happened. Direct dating of Neanderthal remains found alongside Châtelperronian tools proved beyond doubt that these were indeed Neanderthal creations. We're talking about tools that show a level of technological complexity that rivals anything made by early modern humans of the same period. Long, slender stone blades. Carefully crafted points. Even personal ornaments, perforated animal teeth and shells that could only have served as jewelry. Now, you have to understand how significant this is. Traditional Neanderthal technology, what we call the Mousterian tradition, had remained remarkably consistent for over 200,000 years. These were effective tools, don't get me wrong, sophisticated scrapers, points, and cutting implements that served Neanderthals well through countless ice ages. But they followed patterns that were almost ritualistic in their consistency. The Châtelperronian tools are different. They show experimentation, risk-taking, a willingness to abandon tried-and-true methods for something new. And they appear right at the moment when modern humans are moving into Neanderthal territories. So here's the question that keeps archaeologists awake at night: did Neanderthals develop these innovations independently, or did they learn them through contact with modern humans? It's a debate that has profound implications for how we understand Neanderthal intelligence and cultural capacity. The independent innovation camp makes a compelling case. They point out that Neanderthals had already shown flashes of sophisticated behavior, pigment use, symbolic artifacts, complex hunting strategies. Perhaps the environmental pressures and population stresses we discussed earlier created exactly the conditions where innovation becomes essential. When your traditional ways of life are failing, you adapt or you perish. And there's another factor we need to consider. As Neanderthal populations shrank and became more isolated, the dynamics of cultural transmission would have changed dramatically. In smaller groups, individual innovations have a better chance of catching on. One skilled toolmaker could revolutionize an entire band's technology. But the cultural exchange hypothesis is equally intriguing. We know that Neanderthals and modern humans coexisted in the same regions for thousands of years. It's almost impossible to imagine that these two intelligent species never observed each other's techniques. Maybe what we're seeing in the Châtelperronian isn't pure innovation, maybe it's adaptation. Neanderthals seeing modern human tools and thinking, we can do that too, but better. Recent research has added fascinating nuances to this debate. Microscopic analysis of Châtelperronian tools shows that while the forms may resemble modern human technology, the actual manufacturing techniques often remain distinctly Neanderthal. It's as if they were reverse engineering modern human innovations but filtering them through their own technological traditions. There's also the matter of timing. The Châtelperronian appears to emerge just before modern humans arrive in some regions, but after they've arrived in others. This patchy distribution suggests a complex story. Perhaps some innovations were independent, while others represent cultural borrowing. We see similar patterns in other late Neanderthal sites across Europe. In Italy, there's the Eleusinian industry, characterized by distinctive crescentic tools and the earliest known Neanderthal use of ochre for body painting. In Spain, late Neanderthal sites show increasing use of marine shells for tools and ornaments, often transported considerable distances from the coast. What strikes me most about these technologies is their timing. They don't appear during periods of stability, they emerge during crisis. As the ice advances, as territories shrink, as competition intensifies, we see these bursts of innovation. It's as if necessity truly was the mother of invention for these final Neanderthal populations. But here's what makes this story even more poignant. Despite these innovations, despite this remarkable adaptability in the face of enormous challenges, it wasn't enough. The tools of the Twilight, sophisticated as they were, couldn't overcome the broader forces working against Neanderthal survival. And that raises a profound question about the nature of extinction itself. We often think of extinction as the failure to adapt, but what if it's sometimes the opposite? What if these late innovations represent not just Neanderthal ingenuity, but also the desperation of a species fighting for survival against impossible odds? Some researchers have suggested that the burst of innovation we see in late Neanderthal technology might actually have been counterproductive. Energy and time spent developing new tools and techniques might have been better invested in basic survival activities. In small populations operating at the margins of survival, even cultural innovation can become a luxury they couldn't afford. As we examine these final tool traditions, we're not just looking at stone and bone artifacts. We're looking at the material expressions of minds under pressure, of cultures adapting to circumstances that their ancestors never had to face. Each carefully crafted blade, each experimental technique, each borrowed innovation tells us something about the complex interplay between necessity, creativity, and survival. But tools alone don't determine survival. And as we'll see next, the mathematical realities of small population sizes were creating challenges that no amount of technological innovation could solve. The mathematical reality of extinction is surprisingly simple. You don't need a catastrophic volcanic eruption or a sudden climate shift to wipe out a species. Sometimes, all you need is arithmetic. When we look at the late Neanderthal populations through the lens of population genetics, we encounter numbers that should make us pause. The latest modeling studies, drawing on both archaeological site density and genetic diversity analysis, suggest something almost unthinkable. In regions like the Iberian Peninsula, where some of the last Neanderthals made their stand, we might be talking about breeding populations of just a few hundred individuals. Across entire mountain ranges and river valleys, scattered in small groups that rarely encountered one another. Now, you might think a few hundred sounds manageable. After all, plenty of modern hunter-gatherer societies have thrived with similar numbers. But here's where the mathematics of small populations becomes unforgiving. Every birth, every death, every accident or illness carries exponentially more weight when your entire regional gene pool consists of maybe 30 to 50 reproductive adults. Let's walk through what this actually means on the ground. Imagine you're part of a Neanderthal group living in a Spanish valley around 30,000 years ago. Your extended family unit, let's say 15 adults and their children, represents perhaps 3% of all the Neanderthals left in the entire region. If a harsh winter kills half your group, or if several young adults die in a hunting accident, you've just reduced the total breeding population by a significant fraction. There's no neighboring village to intermarry with, no distant cousins migrating in from other regions. The pool is what it is. This is where population genetics reveals one of nature's cruel mathematical truths. Small populations inevitably lead to inbreeding, and inbreeding leads to what scientists call inbreeding depression. Harmful recessive genes that would normally be diluted in a large population begin to express themselves more frequently. Birth defects increase. Fertility drops. Immune systems weaken. It's a downward spiral that accelerates with each generation. The genetic evidence from late Neanderthal remains supports this grim picture. When researchers analyze DNA from sites like El Sidrón in Spain, they find telltale signatures of reduced genetic diversity. The mitochondrial DNA lineages, which pass from mother to child, show signs of severe bottlenecking. These populations were genetically impoverished, carrying the accumulated burden of generations of small group sizes. But inbreeding was just one piece of the mathematical puzzle. Small populations also face what population ecologists call demographic stochasticity, random fluctuations in births and deaths that can push a species over the edge purely by chance. In a large population, these fluctuations average out. Some years you might have more deaths than births, other years the reverse, but the overall trend remains stable. In tiny populations, random variation becomes deadly. Consider this scenario, modeled by researchers at the University of Cambridge. You start with a Neanderthal population of 200 individuals scattered across several family groups. In any given year, random chance might result in slightly more deaths than births. Maybe it's a bad winter, maybe it's an unlucky hunting season, maybe it's just statistical variation. Your population drops to 180. The following year, the same thing happens. 160. Once you fall below certain critical thresholds, most models suggest around 50 to 100 breeding individuals, recovery becomes mathematically improbable. You're trapped in what's called an extinction vortex. The archaeological record suggests this is exactly what happened across much of Europe. Site after site shows the same pattern. Neanderthal occupation becomes increasingly sparse and intermittent during their final millennia. Caves that once hosted large groups show evidence of only brief, occasional visits. Tool assemblages become smaller and more impoverished. The signature of a species under severe demographic stress. Recent computer simulations have tried to model exactly how this process unfolded. Researchers input variables like climate change, resource availability, competition with modern humans, and population size, then run thousands of scenarios to see which factors prove most decisive. The results are sobering. Even without direct competition from modern humans, many Neanderthal populations appear to have been on trajectories toward extinction purely due to their small numbers. The mathematics alone were working against them. Now, there's an important caveat here. These population estimates come with significant uncertainty. Archaeological sites don't preserve perfectly, and we're extrapolating from incomplete data. Some researchers argue that late Neanderthal populations might have been larger than the models suggest. But even the most optimistic estimates rarely exceed a few thousand individuals across all of Europe during their final phase. In evolutionary terms, that's still dangerously small. What makes this particularly poignant is that Neanderthals weren't stupid or poorly adapted. They had survived ice ages before. They had developed sophisticated hunting strategies and tool technologies. They understood their environments intimately. But evolution doesn't care about individual intelligence or cultural sophistication when the numbers game turns against you. A species that falls below critical population thresholds faces mathematical laws as inexorable as gravity. This brings us to one of the most haunting aspects of the Neanderthal extinction. Many of these final populations might have been aware, on some level, of their increasing isolation. Group sizes getting smaller. Fewer encounters with other families. Children born with defects that hadn't appeared in previous generations. They would have had no framework for understanding population genetics, but they would have experienced its effects firsthand. The cruel irony is that this demographic crisis unfolded just as modern humans were expanding across Europe. Whether through direct competition, resource depletion, or disease transmission, the arrival of our species added additional pressure to populations already struggling with the mathematics of survival. It wasn't necessarily a conquest. It might have been more like the final weight that tips a precarious balance. We'll explore that interaction between our species shortly. But first, we need to understand that the DNA evidence reveals something unexpected about those final encounters. Despite their declining numbers, despite the mathematical forces working against them, the last Neanderthals didn't simply fade away in isolation. They left traces of themselves that we still carry today. And this brings us to one of the most remarkable discoveries in modern science, one that literally lives within your cells as you listen to this. If you're of non-African ancestry, roughly 2 to 4% of your DNA comes directly from Neanderthals. Think about that for a moment. Every time your cells divide, every time you breathe, every time your heart beats, you're carrying forward genetic instructions that were first written in the bodies of people who lived and loved and struggled through ice ages we can barely imagine. The story of how we discovered this genetic legacy reads like a detective novel. In the 1990s, scientists began extracting DNA from ancient bones, starting with mitochondrial DNA, the genetic material passed down through mothers. Early results suggested that Neanderthals were a distinct evolutionary branch, separate from modern humans. But as techniques improved and we learned to read nuclear DNA from ancient specimens, a more complex picture emerged. We weren't just different species passing like ships in the night. We were populations that met, mingled, and left lasting marks on each other's genetic destiny. The breakthrough came in 2010, when Svante Pääbo's team at the Max Planck Institute published the first Neanderthal genome. Suddenly, we could compare our DNA letter by letter with genetic sequences that hadn't been active for 30,000 years. What they found challenged everything we thought we knew about human evolution. Modern humans and Neanderthals hadn't simply replaced one another, they had interbred, and significantly. But here's where the detective work gets really interesting. The pattern of Neanderthal DNA in modern genomes tells us when and where these encounters took place. You see, genetic recombination, the shuffling that happens when DNA gets passed from parent to child, breaks up long stretches of inherited sequence over time. The longer ago an interbreeding event occurred, the shorter the remaining Neanderthal segments in our genomes today. It's like a genetic clock, counting backwards through generations. By analyzing the length of these Neanderthal segments across thousands of modern genomes, scientists have reconstructed a timeline of contact. The major pulse of interbreeding happened early, probably around 50,000 to 60,000 years ago, when modern humans first expanded out of Africa and encountered Neanderthal populations in the Middle East. But that's not the whole story. Smaller, more recent interbreeding events continued to occur, right up until the final Neanderthal populations disappeared. In fact, some of the most recent Neanderthal DNA in European genomes appears to come from encounters that happened as recently as 37,000 years ago. These late genetic exchanges coincide perfectly with our archaeological timeline of Neanderthal decline. Picture this: small bands of the last Neanderthals, perhaps numbering in the dozens, occasionally meeting groups of modern humans at the edges of their shrinking territories. Sometimes these encounters ended in conflict. Sometimes they ended in cooperation. And sometimes they ended in relationships that produced children. The genetic evidence reveals something both beautiful and heartbreaking about these final encounters. We can actually identify specific Neanderthal genetic variants that were beneficial to modern humans, immune system genes that helped us fight new diseases, adaptations for cold climates, even variants that affect skin and hair color. Natural selection preserved these useful Neanderthal traits and spread them through expanding human populations. In a very real sense, parts of the Neanderthal genome were so valuable that evolution refused to let them go extinct. There's a particular poignancy in the immune system genes we inherited. Many of these Neanderthal variants help us fight infections that we would have encountered as we moved into new environments, diseases that Neanderthals had been dealing with for hundreds of thousands of years in Europe and Asia. They gave us their hard-won immunological wisdom, purchased through millennia of natural selection, passed down through the most intimate possible exchange between our species. But the story isn't entirely one of beneficial gifts. Some Neanderthal genetic variants carry costs. Certain inherited segments are associated with increased risk of depression, skin lesions, even blood clotting disorders. It's as if we're still paying the biological price for those ancient encounters, carrying both the benefits and burdens of our complex evolutionary history. What's fascinating is how this genetic legacy is distributed around the world today. East Asian populations carry slightly more Neanderthal DNA than Europeans do, about 2.3 to 2.6% compared to roughly 1.8 to 2.4%. This suggests that modern humans encountered Neanderthal populations multiple times and places as they spread across Eurasia. Each encounter left its own genetic signature, now scattered across billions of people. Perhaps most remarkably, we can even identify which modern human populations carry DNA from the very last Neanderthals. Some European genomes contain genetic segments that can only have come from Neanderthal populations that survived until after 40,000 years ago, the final chapters we've been exploring. These aren't just abstract percentages in a scientific paper. These are genetic memories of actual people, actual relationships, actual moments when two different kinds of humans looked at each other and saw not enemies, but potential partners. Recent studies using artificial intelligence to scan modern genomes have identified even more Neanderthal DNA than we initially realized. As our analytical tools improve, the Neanderthal contribution to modern humans keeps growing. Some estimates now suggest that up to 8% of the Neanderthal genome is preserved across all modern human populations combined. We're walking libraries of their genetic heritage, carrying forward their evolutionary innovations even as we've forgotten their faces. You might wonder what this means for our understanding of Neanderthal extinction. If they contributed so significantly to our genomes, did they really go extinct at all? It's a philosophical question as much as a scientific one. Their distinct populations disappeared, their unique cultures ended, their tool tradition ceased. But their genes lived on, embedded in the expanding populations of modern humans who would eventually spread across the globe. In a sense, every person of non-African ancestry is a genetic monument to those final encounters between Neanderthals and modern humans. We carry within us the last gifts of a vanished people, their final biological legacy preserved in the most fundamental way possible. As we move forward in our exploration of the Neanderthal twilight, we'll discover how this genetic story connects to the archaeological evidence of their final days. There's something haunting about the way entire civilizations can simply vanish from the archaeological record. One day their tools are scattered across a cave floor, their fires still smoldering in ancient hearths, and then silence. Nothing but empty stone and the gradual accumulation of sterile sediment. This is the mystery we encounter when we trace the final chapters of Neanderthal existence across Europe, what archaeologists call the extinction horizon. Picture yourself as a researcher carefully excavating a cave site in northern Spain. You're working through the layers of human occupation, moving backward through time with each centimeter you dig. In the upper layers, you find the unmistakable signatures of modern human presence, blade tools with their characteristic long, sharp edges, bone needles for sewing, perhaps even fragments of carved figurines. These artifacts tell the story of Homo sapiens, our own species, making themselves at home in European landscapes. But as you continue digging deeper, something extraordinary happens. There's a layer, sometimes just a few centimeters thick, where the modern human artifacts simply disappear. Below that line, you begin finding the thicker, more robust stone tools that we associate with Neanderthals. Their distinctive Mousterian technology, perfected over hundreds of thousands of years. The transition is often startlingly abrupt. This invisible boundary exists at archaeological sites across the continent. From the Cantabrian coast of Spain to the river valleys of France, from the caves of Italy to the rock shelters of Central Europe, we see the same pattern repeated again and again. Neanderthal material culture ends, and modern human culture begins. There's rarely any obvious mixing, no gradual transition from one toolkit to another. It's as if an invisible line was drawn across the European landscape, marking the moment when one human species gave way to another. But here's where the story becomes more complex. When we look closely at the dating of these sites, something interesting emerges. The extinction horizon isn't actually a single moment in time, it's more like a wave moving across the continent. In some regions, this transition happened around 40,000 years ago. In others, particularly in southern and western refuges, Neanderthal signatures persist much longer. Consider the site of Gorham's Cave in Gibraltar, which we explored earlier. Here, the extinction horizon sits at around 28,000 years ago, a full 12,000 years after some northern sites show the transition. This temporal patchwork reveals something crucial about how extinction actually works in the real world. It's not a single catastrophic event, but rather a gradual contraction of range and population until the final holdout populations simply fade away. What makes these boundaries even more intriguing is what they don't show. In most cases, there's no evidence of warfare or violent conflict. No arrowheads embedded in Neanderthal bones, no signs of battles fought over territory. The archaeological record suggests something far more subtle, a process more like being quietly displaced than dramatically conquered. Some sites do show intriguing exceptions to this pattern. At a few locations, archaeologists have found what appears to be mixed assemblages, layers where Neanderthal and modern human tools appear together. These rare instances tantalize us with the possibility of direct contact, perhaps trade or cultural exchange between the two species. But such sites are uncommon, making their interpretation hotly debated among researchers. There's also the question of what happened during those invisible moments at the boundary itself. Imagine you could travel back in time to witness this transition. Would you see the last Neanderthal family abandoning a cave as modern humans approached from the distance? Or would it be more mundane, a gradual shift in who controlled the best hunting grounds, who had access to crucial resources during harsh winters? The extinction horizon also reveals something profound about the nature of archaeological preservation. The fact that we can see these boundaries at all speaks to the careful accumulation of sediment in caves and rock shelters over thousands of years. Each layer represents a slice of time, preserving the debris of ancient lives like pages in a book. But like any book, some pages are missing, some are smudged beyond reading, and others preserve only fragments of the full story. When we map these extinction boundaries across Europe, a pattern emerges that mirrors what we know about Neanderthal retreat into refuges. The wave of replacement moved roughly from east to west and north to south, following the same general direction as the advancing ice sheets and the expanding populations of modern humans. It's as if we can see the tide of change washing across an entire continent, leaving different human worlds in its wake. What's particularly striking is how sharp these transitions tend to be. You might expect to find evidence of gradual cultural change, perhaps Neanderthals adopting some modern human technologies or vice versa. While this did happen in some rare cases, the controversial Chattleperonian industry that we discussed earlier might represent exactly this kind of cultural mixing. The overall pattern is one of replacement rather than gradual assimilation. This sharpness tells us something important about how these two human species interacted, or perhaps more accurately, how they didn't interact. Despite sharing landscapes for thousands of years, despite occasional interbreeding that we can detect in our DNA, the archaeological record suggests they remained largely separate, each maintaining their own distinct ways of making tools, processing food, and organizing their lives. The extinction horizon also forces us to confront an uncomfortable reality about our own species' expansion. Modern humans didn't simply fill empty landscapes when we left Africa and spread across the world. We moved into territories already occupied by other human species, and in every case, those other species eventually disappeared. The boundary layers in European caves represent just one chapter in this larger story of human replacement. As we examine these invisible borders preserved in stone and sediment, we're looking at the archaeological signature of one of the most significant transitions in human history. These thin layers of rock mark the moment when the human family tree, which had branched and flourished for hundreds of thousands of years, was pruned back to a single surviving lineage, our own. The silence that follows the extinction horizon speaks volumes about both the fragility of human existence and the profound consequences of our species' remarkable expansion across the globe. And so we arrive at perhaps the most profound question of our entire journey tonight. When the last Neanderthal drew their final breath somewhere in the caves of Gibraltar or the valleys of the Caucasus, what exactly did our world lose? It's a question that haunts paleoanthropologists, and one that becomes more poignant the more we learn about our vanished relatives. Because the Neanderthals weren't simply a rough draft of modern humanity, they were a fully realized human species with their own remarkable adaptations, their own solutions to the challenges of survival, their own way of being human in this world. Consider their bodies first. The Neanderthals had spent nearly 400,000 years perfecting themselves for life in Ice Age Europe. Their barrel chests housed lungs capable of processing the thin, cold air of glacial landscapes. Their powerful limbs could generate the force needed to thrust spears through thick mammoth hide. Their robust skulls protected brains that were, remarkably, larger on average than our own. But it was more than just physical adaptation. The Neanderthals had developed sophisticated technologies that we're only beginning to appreciate. They were master firekeepers, maintaining hearths in caves across Europe for tens of thousands of years. They crafted composite tools, binding stone points to wooden shafts with carefully prepared tree resins and sinew. Some of their spear points show a level of symmetry and craftsmanship that rivals anything produced by early modern humans. And then there's the birch tar. This might sound mundane, but the production of birch tar represents one of the most complex technological processes known from the prehistoric world. To make this adhesive, you need to heat birch bark in the absence of oxygen at precisely the right temperature. Too hot, and it burns. Too cool, and nothing happens. The Neanderthals were doing this routinely 200,000 years ago, suggesting a sophisticated understanding of chemistry that we hadn't given them credit for. You might be wondering about their minds, their inner lives. Here, the archaeological record offers tantalizing glimpses. Neanderthals buried their dead, not always, but often enough to suggest this was meaningful behavior. At Shanidar Cave in Iraq, we found the remains of an elderly Neanderthal man who had lived for years with severe disabilities. He was blind in one eye, had a withered arm, and walked with a pronounced limp. Yet his bones show he lived well into old age, suggesting his community cared for him long after he could contribute to hunting or gathering. The Neanderthals made jewelry. They painted cave walls. They collected fossils and interesting stones, sometimes carrying them hundreds of kilometers from their source. At Krapina in Croatia, researchers found eagle talons that had been deliberately modified, possibly worn as pendants. These aren't the behaviors of dim-witted brutes. These are the actions of people who found meaning and beauty in their world. Perhaps most remarkably, the Neanderthals may have been our cognitive equals in many respects. Recent studies suggest their brains developed along different trajectories than ours, not inferior, but alternative. Where modern humans seem to have specialized in social cognition and language processing, Neanderthals may have devoted more neural resources to visual and spatial processing. They were seeing and navigating their world in ways we can barely imagine. So what did we lose when they vanished? We lost an entire branch of human possibility. We lost the knowledge they had accumulated about surviving in environments we struggle to endure even with modern technology. We lost their unique solutions to technological problems, their artistic traditions, their ways of understanding the relationship between humans and the natural world. But perhaps most significantly, we lost the diversity of human experience itself. For hundreds of thousands of years, being human meant something different depending on whether you were born into a Neanderthal community or one of our own ancestors. There were multiple ways to be intelligent, multiple ways to be social, multiple ways to make meaning from existence. The extinction of the Neanderthals represents what evolutionary biologists call a profound narrowing of possibilities. Imagine if all music in the world suddenly became a single genre, if all languages collapsed into one tongue, if all architecture followed a single blueprint. That's something like what happened to human diversity when we lost our nearest relatives. It's worth considering how different our world might be if they had survived. Would we have developed different technologies, different art forms, different ways of organizing society? Would the presence of another human species have made us more humble, more aware of our place as one variation among many? We'll never know, and that uncertainty is part of what makes their loss so profound. There's something else we lost that's harder to quantify but no less real. We lost the mirror they provided. When modern humans first encountered Neanderthals, they met beings who were unmistakably human yet distinctly different. They would have recognized the intelligence in those eyes, the intentionality in those actions, the humanity in those hands crafting tools by firelight. But they would also have seen that humanity could take forms other than their own. Today, when we ask what makes us human, we can only compare ourselves to other species separated from us by millions of years of evolution. We've lost the perspective that comes from seeing humanity through eyes that were both like and unlike our own. The Neanderthals' extinction also marked a turning point in the trajectory of life on Earth. For the first time in our planet's history, a single species of human began to dominate not just a region or a continent, but the entire world. The patterns that led to modern human global expansion, the technological innovation, the social cooperation, the relentless push into new territories, these same patterns spell doom for our closest relatives. As we sit here in our modern world, surrounded by the fruits of that expansion, we might pause to consider what we inherited from that ancient triumph. We gained the earth, but we lost the conversation we might have had with other forms of human consciousness. We won the future, but at the cost of paths not taken, songs not sung, stories not told. The darkness that swallowed the last Neanderthals wasn't just the end of their lineage. It was the closing of a chapter in the larger story of what it means to be human, a chapter we're still learning to read by the faint light it left behind. And so we reach the end of our journey through the long twilight of the Neanderthals, but as we settle into the quiet of this conclusion, I find myself thinking that endings in deep time aren't really endings at all. They're more like doors closing in a house with many rooms, the sound echoing through corridors we're still discovering. The last Neanderthal who died some 28,000 years ago couldn't have known they were the last. They woke up, searched for food, perhaps wondered about the strange new people they occasionally encountered, and went to sleep under the same stars we see tonight. Their final breath was just another moment in what felt like an ongoing story. But we know something they couldn't. We know they were living through one of the most profound transitions in the history of consciousness itself. When that last individual died, an entire way of seeing the world died with them. Think about that for a moment. The Neanderthals had their own relationship with fire, their own way of reading animal tracks, their own understanding of which plants healed and which stones made the best tools. They had 400,000 years of accumulated wisdom about surviving ice ages, about making homes in caves, about the rhythm of seasons in a world so different from ours that we can barely imagine it. What strikes me most as we've traced their story is how familiar their struggles feel. Climate change disrupting their world. Competition for resources. Small populations trying to maintain their culture while adapting to rapid environmental shifts. The parallels to our own moment aren't lost on any of us, I think. We're living through our own period of dramatic change, our own time when the old ways of doing things might not be enough for what's coming. The Neanderthals remind us that survival isn't guaranteed, not even for a species as successful as they were. They survived ice ages that would have wiped us out completely. They lived through volcanic winters, massive climate swings, predators that make our worst nightmares seem tame. They were stronger than us, better adapted to cold, with brains as large as ours. Yet something about the particular combination of pressures they faced in those final millennia proved too much. Was it competition with us? Was it climate change? Was it simply bad luck, the random factors that can doom any small population? Probably all of these, working together in ways we're still trying to understand. But here's what gets me, they came so close to making it. If the climate had shifted just slightly differently, if their populations had been just a bit larger, if the timing of our expansion into Europe had been delayed by even a few thousand years, we might be sharing this planet with them today. Imagine that world for a moment. Two human species, each with their own cultures, their own ways of thinking about existence. What conversations might we have had? What could we have learned from each other? Their loss isn't just the loss of individuals or even a species. It's the loss of an entire branch of human possibility, a different way of being conscious in the universe. Yet they're not entirely gone, are they? Those traces of Neanderthal DNA flowing through our veins mean that something of them continues. Every person of non-African descent carries these ancient genetic whispers, fragments of immunity, adaptations to cold, neural patterns we don't fully understand yet. In a very real sense, the Neanderthals didn't go extinct. They were absorbed, their story becoming part of our story. But there's something else, something harder to quantify. I think their disappearance changed us in ways we're only beginning to recognize. We became the sole inheritors of human consciousness, the only ones left to wonder about our place in the cosmos. Maybe that solitude shaped us, made us the restless, questioning species we are today. Maybe the loss of our closest relatives is part of what drives our endless search for meaning, our need to understand where we came from and where we're going. As you drift off tonight, you might find yourself thinking about those final Neanderthal communities huddled in caves along the Mediterranean coast, watching the stars wheel overhead, not knowing they were living through an ending. But here's the thing about endings in deep time. They're also beginnings. The space left by the Neanderthals created room for us to become who we are. Their absence shaped our presence. And maybe that's the real lesson of their story. Not that extinction is inevitable, but that consciousness itself is precious precisely because it can be lost. Every moment of awareness, every question we ask about our origins, every story we tell about the deep past, is a kind of victory over the darkness that claimed the Neanderthals. We are the Neanderthals' legacy as much as we are our own. We carry their dreams forward into an uncertain future, along with our own. When we look up at the night sky and wonder about our place in the universe, when we feel that deep longing to understand where we came from, we're honoring not just our own curiosity but theirs as well. The Twilight archive of human memory stretches back through countless generations, holding the stories of all those who came before. Tonight, as sleep carries you into your own private darkness, you join that ancient tradition of human consciousness resting, dreaming, preparing for whatever tomorrow might bring. The Neanderthals sleep now in the deeper darkness of extinction, but their story lives on in the questions they've left us, in the genetic whispers they've woven into our being, and in the endless human drive to understand our place in the vast, mysterious story of life on Earth. Sleep well, knowing that you are part of a chain of consciousness that stretches back hundreds of thousands of years, a chain that has survived ice ages and volcanic winters, climate shifts and cosmic accidents. You are the inheritor of all those who came before, including our vanished cousins who once wondered about the stars from caves that echo now only with the sound of wind and time.